Hello everyone, welcome or welcome back. My name is Chris and on this channel I share my cross stitch journey. This time I decided to record a little stitch with me video. I will probably divide this video into two parts. In the first part I'll be rambling about various things, and in the second part I thought I would stop rambling and simply stitch while maybe describing some of the things I'll be doing for those of you who would like to follow my pattern or the method I'm using more closely. I may speed up some sections so that the video doesn't become too long, although I think it will be long anyway. So this is my new start, Fox and Bunny pattern, which many of you already know from my shop. I ordered all the necessary DMC colors and prepared floss packs for each of them. In my box I still had some space on the right hand side, so I was hoping I could fit these additional colors in as well. Luckily I managed to fit everything into this one box, and now I have almost 200 colors in total that I use across 3 projects. It's funny how quickly the collection grows. When I first started using floss packs I thought I would only need a handful of colors, but now it feels like every new project introduces a few shades I don't already have. If I start another project, I will probably have to move to a bigger box. I think when that happens, I will create one large box for all DMC colors so that I don't have to keep reorganizing everything whenever a new project introduces new shades. In the new box, I am also planning to use dividers made from thicker cardstock to help keep the floss pack standing upright, just as I showed in one of my recent videos. Once everything was organized in numerical order, I was ready to start stitching. There is something very satisfying about getting everything organized before a new start. I know not everyone enjoys that part, but for me it almost feels like a little ritual before the first stitch goes in. I spent quite a bit of time debating whether I should stitch this project on 25 count Lugana with full crosses, 24 count Congress stramming using 10 stitches, or 20 count Aida with full crosses using either 1 or 2 strands. I already had the Congress stramming stretched on the frame and ready to go, but in the end I decided to use 20 count Aida. I thought it might be a good idea to gradually get used to higher counts and smaller stitches, and 20 count seemed like a reasonable step up from the 16 count that I am more familiar with. The next decision was whether to use 1 strand or 2. I did quite a bit of research and it seems that 20 count can be a bit tricky. Full crosses with 2 strands can look quite bulky, especially in confetti-rich areas, while 1 strand doesn't provide what many stitchers would consider good coverage. I really wanted to try stitching with a single strand, so that's the option I chose, and now I understand what people mean when they describe the finished look as airy or delicate. The coverage isn't dense and you can definitely see some of the fabric showing through between those very fine strands of thread. But you know what? I think I actually like it. It's different from 16 count, but there is something very elegant about it. I also find 20 count Aida very comfortable to stitch on. The holes are still large enough that I can see them clearly, and because I'm only using 1 strand, the stitches don't fill the holes completely. That leaves more room when surrounding stitches need to go through the same hole, and overall the stitching process feels very smooth. So far I'm quite happy with my choice and I'm curious to see how it develops as the project grows. I've had moments when I wondered whether I should stop and restart with 2 strands or perhaps switch to 25 count altogether, but I think this is simply part of the learning process. For now I'm going to continue with 20 count Aida and one strand full crosses and see how I feel about it over time. The nice thing is that every project teaches us something. If I decide later that I prefer a different fabric or a different level of coverage, I can always try that on the next project. The only way to really find out what works for you is to experiment and gain experience with different fabrics and stitching styles. I must admit that 25 count still feels a little intimidating. It looks so much smaller, and part of me wonders whether it might be too small for my eyes and my stitching style. On the other hand, I really like the idea of stitching with one strand and achieving that finer, more dense coverage, so at some point I know I will have to give it a try. Sometimes there really isn't any substitute for experience. In fact, I have already ordered a few additional colors, new scroll frame and easy count Lugana 25 count fabric, and I'm going to start the Forest Friends pattern on it. I started this project using a size 26 needle, but I quickly switched to a size 28. I've actually grown quite fond of using size 28 needles and have even started using them on 16 count Aida as well. The problem is that I now have so many different needles that I rarely know which size I'm actually holding, although the smaller ones are a bit easier to distinguish from the bigger ones. At some point they all seem to get mixed together, so now I mostly choose them based on feel rather than size. In the bottom right corner you can see that I'm using Markup RXP. After spending some time using Saga, I eventually came back to Markup because it simply suits my stitching style better. For the way I work, it feels much more straightforward and requires less tapping and clicking. Saga has a lot of features and I can certainly see why many stitchers enjoy using it, but after experimenting with both apps, I realized that I don't actually use most of those additional functions. What I really need is something simple, efficient, and easy to navigate while stitching. So for now, Markup RXP remains my app of choice, and I'm quite happy with it. I've actually started using it more on my phone than on my iPad, and I think it's a bit more convenient for me. Anyway, that was probably a much longer technical introduction than I originally intended, so let's move on to the subjects I noted down and actually begin today's Stitch With Me chat. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for the amazing feedback I've been receiving. Almost every day I wake up to new comments, messages, and emails. To be completely honest, it can sometimes be quite difficult to keep up with everything, but I'm trying my best. I hope I've replied to everyone. If I missed your message, please feel free to gently scold me in the comments. I truly appreciate every kind word you leave. It means a lot to know that you enjoy the videos and that some of the things I share are helpful to you. Creating these videos is something I really enjoy, but hearing that they bring value to other stitchers makes it even more rewarding. I would like to thank all the fellow flosstubers who have mentioned my channel in their videos. Every time someone mentions me, it's a slightly scary moment because I never quite know what they are going to say, but at the same time it's incredibly kind and I'm always grateful that something in one of my videos caught your attention. The list of mentions has grown surprisingly long and I appreciate each and every one of you. I will include all the channels in the video descriptions so that anyone who isn't familiar with them yet can easily find them. And of course, I can't forget about the subscribers. I genuinely don't know when this happened, but somehow this channel has passed 4,000 subscribers. So thank you very much for raising my stress levels. You know, the more subscribers there are, the more responsibility you feel. As if I didn't already have enough things to worry about. But joking aside, it really is unbelievable. Just a little over a year ago, I was simply thinking about returning to cross stitch after many years away from this hobby. At that point, I had no idea that I would end up starting a YouTube channel. If someone had told me back then that so many people would be watching my videos, I probably wouldn't have believed them. In many ways, this whole experience has completely reorganized my life and changed my priorities. I spend much more time stitching, planning videos, reading comments, and talking to fellow stitchers than I ever imagined I would. So thank you for watching, for commenting, for sharing your thoughts and experiences, and for being part of this journey. Many of you stitch non-full coverage pieces, and I have to say that they are absolutely beautiful, inspiring, and very tempting. As many of you know, I love full coverage pieces. I come from a painting background, and full coverage projects feel very much like paintings to me. I enjoy watching an image slowly appear one stitch at a time, just as I would build a watercolor painting layer by layer. But there is also something very special about samplers and quackers, which, to be completely honest, I'm still not entirely sure how to distinguish from one another. I probably need a proper lesson on that at some point. I've seen so many beautiful samplers in your videos lately that I've become very tempted to stitch one myself. But then we arrive at a slightly strange aspect of my personality. There are countless wonderful patterns available that I could simply buy and enjoy stitching. The logical thing would be to choose one, start stitching, and be perfectly happy. But no, apparently that's not how my brain works. Instead of buying a sampler pattern, I somehow ended up designing a sampler by myself. I don't know why I have this tendency. Whenever I see something beautiful, my first thought often isn't, I would like to stitch that, but my first thought is, I wonder if I could create something like that, make my own version. It's a little ridiculous when I say it out loud because there are so many talented designers creating incredible patterns, yet there is always a small voice in my head saying, yes, but perhaps you could design one yourself. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that this is exactly how I've approached watercolor painting throughout my life. For those of you who may not know, my main work is teaching watercolor painting and creating watercolor tutorials. I've spent years learning from books, videos, and other artists, but the funny thing is that I never followed tutorials in the traditional sense. I never really wanted to paint exactly what someone else was painting. What interested me was understanding the idea behind it. I wanted to learn the technique, the approach, the way someone solved a problem, or the way they used color. Then I would take those ideas and try to apply them to something of my own. I would let everything I learned sink in, absorb it, and then use it as a starting point rather than a destination, if that makes sense. And now that I think about it, stitching seems to be following a very similar path. I admire countless designs. There are so many patterns that I think are beautiful, clever, and incredibly well designed. And honestly, I could happily stitch many of them. But for some reason, I seem to get the greatest excitement from creating something myself and then bringing that design to life through stitching. Of course, that means I have to spend days or weeks creating a pattern before I can even start stitching it, which is probably not the most efficient approach, but apparently that is how my creative brain has decided to function. So if there happens to be a psychologist in the room, please feel free to explain this behavior to me in the comments. As a first experiment, I actually designed a very simple non-full coverage piece with a large welcome text surrounded by flowers and birds. You can see it now on the screen. This was really my test project, the very first one. At the time, I was trying to figure out whether I would enjoy designing this type of pattern, and it turns out that the answer is yes. I enjoyed the process much more than I expected. Since then, I've started working on several much larger and much more complex sampler style designs. I'm not quite ready to show those yet because I'd like them to maintain a surprise for a little while longer, but they are definitely keeping me busy behind the scenes. And by the way, if you happen to like this design, I have prepared all the necessary files for you. I've prepared files for Markup RXP, Pattern Keeper and Saga, so no matter which app you use, you should be able to start stitching right away. You will find the download link in the video description below. Speaking of designs, I have recently added a few new patterns to my shop. I'm constantly working on converting my watercolor paintings into cross-stitch patterns, although the process takes quite a bit longer than many people might expect. I don't simply click a button and export a chart and call it finished. The conversion is really just the beginning. After that, I usually spend many days of cleaning up the pattern, especially removing what stitchers often call ninja stitches, those single isolated stitches that can make a pattern more frustrating to stitch without necessarily improving the final result. Of course, it's not always as straightforward as simply deleting them. As both a designer and a stitcher, I know that many ninja stitches are unnecessary and can be replaced with neighboring colors without affecting the appearance of the final piece. Whenever possible, I try to remove those stitches to make the chart more enjoyable to stitch. However, some areas are much more challenging than others. The edges of shapes are usually the trickiest part because smooth transitions often rely on a number of individual stitches. If I remove too many of them, the edge can start to look harsh or blocky, and the gradual transition between colors may be lost. So it becomes a balancing act. I'm constantly asking myself whether a particular stitch is adding meaningful detail or whether it is simply making the chart more complicated than it needs to be. Sometimes I spend days or weeks carefully replacing isolated stitches with neighboring colors and testing whether the image still looks natural. The funny thing is that confetti and ninja stitches are not always the enemy. In some areas, they actually contribute to beautiful textures, subtle color variations, and a more painterly appearance. If I remove too many of them, the pattern may become easier to stitch, but it can also lose some of the character and detail that made the original artwork special. And that's why there are always compromises to make. Every pattern ends up being a balance between preserving the artwork and creating a stitching experience that is enjoyable and practical. I know that some designers simply upload an image generated by AI, convert it into a chart, and publish it immediately. I can understand that because it's quite easy to do, but personally I wouldn't feel comfortable doing it. I don't just sell patterns, I create my paintings and illustrations with my own hands, and I'm selling many years of my learning and painting experience. Patterns are just the end result of a very, very long process. When someone spends hundreds of hours stitching one of my patterns, I want to know that I have invested time into refining it first. So before any design reaches my shop, I always spend quite a bit of time reviewing, adjusting, and improving it as much as I can. You must know that all the ninja stitches in my patterns make up only about 1 to 5% of the ninja stitches that were there before I cleaned up the pattern. So coming back to the patterns, I recently added golden mushrooms, hellebore, rhythm of nature, dripping fragrance, and pansies in a vase. These are all larger patterns. I actually started working on them around March, and most of them have between 400 and 600 stitches on the longer side. When designing them, I wanted to preserve as much detail from the original paintings as possible. In the back of my mind, I was also imagining that one day I might stitch them on 25 count fabric and really take advantage of that level of detail. Two of those paintings are particularly special to me. Rhythm of Nature was the first watercolor painting that I created on a much larger scale than I had worked on before. At the time, it felt like a bit of a leap outside of my comfort zone, but it ended up becoming one of my favorite pieces. What made it even more memorable was that the painting was noticed by the editors of an art magazine here in Poland. They wrote an article about my work and featured the painting on the cover of the magazine. There were always 3 featured artists on the cover, and on that occasion I happened to be one of them. It was one of those moments that felt very surreal and very encouraging at the same time. Because of that story, I was especially excited to turn Rhythm of Nature into a cross-stitch pattern. I'm really pleased with how the chart turned out, and I hope it will be just as enjoyable to stitch one day as it was to paint. Another very special painting is Dripping Fragrance. It was a very complex piece to paint, one of the 2 most complex pieces I have painted. The other one is Wayang Golek, which one day I will also talk to you about, and I will also turn it into a pattern. I worked on it for about 4 months, but I loved every minute of the process. These are the lilies from my mom's garden. They were incredibly fragrant, and I still remember that beautiful sunny afternoon just after the rain. My mom was standing nearby and the sunlight was illuminating the flowers so beautifully. I knew then that they would one day become a challenging but beautiful painting. Now I think they may also become a beautiful cross-stitch piece one day. I still have many more paintings that I would like to convert into patterns one day, but I'm not rushing the process. There are always more ideas waiting in line. Apart from watercolor paintings, I also recently finished a digital illustration featuring a sleeping fox. I called it Dreaming Among Flowers. It's also a bit larger project measuring 400 by 400 stitches. Here you can see the painting process. For digital illustration like this, I primarily use an iPad and the Procreate app, although occasionally I also switch to Fresco, and for vector illustrations or general vector graphics I use Affinity Designer. That's just a little extra information for those of you who are interested in the technical side of things. Sometimes I also make final adjustments in Photoshop. I don't really know why, but I seem to be drawn to painting sleeping animals. Perhaps it's because they naturally create such a peaceful and calming atmosphere. There is something very comforting about a sleeping animal. The scene immediately feels quiet, safe, and relaxed, which are qualities I often enjoy including in my artwork. So this is my latest illustration, and I'm quite happy with how it turned out. At the same time, I'm also working on sampler designs, new digital illustrations, and various other creative projects, of course watercolor paintings as well, so there is definitely more to come. And of course, I still want to find time for stitching itself. Sometimes I genuinely wish a day had 100 hours instead of 24. There are always so many interesting things to learn, create, explore, and experience in life, and it often feels like there simply isn't enough time for all of them. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why I value my creative hobbies so much. Unfortunately, stitching, designing, painting, playing the piano, and most of the things I enjoy doing have one thing in common. They all involve sitting for long periods of time. And rather ironically, sitting for long periods is exactly what I should not be doing. Several years ago, when I was in Indonesia, I was diagnosed with deep vein thrombosis in my left leg, and it was probably one of the most stressful experiences of my life. being in a hospital for over a month on the other side of the world and then having to organize a flight back to Poland was certainly not something I had planned for. Looking back, that experience changed my perspective in many ways. It made me think differently about health, about time, about how quickly life can change. Perhaps that's a conversation for another day because we're supposed to be talking about cross-stitch, not life's big philosophical questions. But ever since then, I've been advised not to sit for extended periods without getting up and moving around. In theory, I should stand up and walk around every 45 minutes or so. In practice, well, I'm sure many of you know how this goes. You sit down to stitch for half an hour and suddenly it's 3 hours later. You've finished an entire section and you're wondering where the afternoon disappeared. The same thing happens to me when I'm painting or playing the piano. Creative work has a strange way of making time disappear. Now let me answer a few questions that I received under my videos. Perhaps some of you will find them interesting as well. So the first question is, do you use a stand of some kind? Yes, I do. I use wooden stands made by Arabesca brand. I will add a link in the video description below for anyone who is interested. At the moment, I own 3 different stands, but recently I've been gravitating toward one particular model. Actually, I've been using only this one recently. I will put a picture of it on the screen now. Interestingly, this is actually the stand that I originally thought I would use the least, but it has become my favorite. It's a table or a lap stand, although I use it exclusively as a table stand. It has 2 adjustable legs, a wooden crossbar connecting them, and 2 adjustable arms that support the scroll frame. What I really like about this setup is that the frame isn't attached to the stand, it simply rests on the top of the arms, and that might not sound like a big advantage at first, but it makes switching between projects incredibly easy. I can have several projects mounted on different scroll frames and I simply place whichever one I want to work on onto the stand. I don't need a separate stand for every project. For me, that's a huge benefit because it saves both space and money. I can easily imagine owning 5 different projects on 5 different scroll frames, but I cannot imagine having 5 different stands with 5 different scroll frames because I wouldn't have place for that. When I first bought this stand, I had 2 concerns. The first concern was that the support arms would get in the way of my stitching, of my right hand that I keep under the project. I remember looking at photos and thinking, if there is a wooden arm behind the fabric, how am I supposed to stitch in that area? Well, clearly my brain wasn't functioning properly that day. The arms are fully adjustable, and because the frame simply rests on top of them, you can slide it left or right as needed. Once everything is positioned correctly, the support arms sit comfortably on the sides and don't interfere with the stitching area at all. It's a little difficult to explain without showing it, but in practice it works very well. My second concern was stability. Since the frame isn't attached to the stand, I was worried that it would wobble every time I moved the needle up and down through the fabric. Again, that turned out to be a completely unnecessary worry. When you're stitching, you're moving the needle, not pushing the entire frame around. The weight of the frame itself keeps everything surprisingly stable, but that said, I do occasionally bump the frame by accident and make it shift slightly. To prevent that, I use side tensioners, the elastic cords with cord locks that many of you are probably familiar with. I simply wrap the tensioner around the corner of the frame and the arm of the stand, tighten it and lock it in place. I think just a rubber band would also work well for this. That holds everything securely and prevents any unwanted movement. So overall, it turned out to be one of those purchases that exceeded my expectations. I bought it thinking it might be useful occasionally, and now it's the stand that I actually use every day. Now let's move on to the next question. Do you edit your videos yourself? I mean cross-stitch, watercolor, piano, and video editing? Yes, I do everything myself, and honestly there are quite a few other things that I enjoy doing as well. I've always been an extremely curious person. There are so many things that interest me, and whenever I discover something new, my first reaction is usually, I wonder how that works, or I wonder if I could learn that. People often ask me where I find the time for everything. The truth is that I don't know. I think a big part of it is simply that I genuinely enjoy the things I do. Painting makes me happy, stitching makes me happy, teaching makes me happy, creating videos makes me happy, learning new things makes me happy. So when I sit down to work on any of those activities, it rarely feels like a chore. In fact, I often joke that I don't like going to sleep because there are still so many things I would like to do. Of course, sleep eventually wins that argument, but I've always felt that life is full of interesting things to learn, create, and experience, and I don't like wasting too much time. Perhaps that's why I tend to have many projects happening at the same time. Some people find it stressful, but for me it feels energizing. I enjoy moving between different creative activities because each one exercises a slightly different part of my brain. And to be honest, I think that my perspective on time in general changed quite a bit after the difficult experiences I went through while I was in Indonesia. Maybe one day I will talk more about that story. I'm not entirely sure whether a flosstube video is the right place for such a conversation, but it certainly had a profound effect on how I look at life. One of the lessons I took from that experience is that I try not to postpone things that matter to me. If there is something that I want to tell to someone, or I want to learn, or create, or experience, I would rather start today than wait for some perfect moment in the future, because that perfect moment may never arrive. So these days I try to appreciate each day a little more, make time for the things I enjoy, and not take that time for granted. Perhaps that's my version of seize the day. Not in a dramatic way, just a quiet reminder to spend a little more time doing the things that make life meaningful. Now the next question was this: why do you go way back to the right to park at the end of each row? This is actually something I covered in detail in my stitching methods video. I've noticed that this question still appears from time to time, so I will leave a link to that video and a timestamp, so it will take you directly to that video where I explain why I always go back to the right side. The next question: how do you change page and cross-stitch diagonally when you come to the second page on Markup? Well, the answer is that I never really think about pages. I prefer to view the entire pattern at once, so for me it doesn't matter where one page ends and the next begins. I've noticed that many stitchers like to track their progress by page numbers, and there is nothing wrong with that. If it helps you stay motivated, that's great. Personally, I tend to think in percentages rather than pages. One reason is that since I started designing patterns myself, I've become very aware that page counts can be quite misleading. The same pattern can be printed on 10 pages, 20 pages, or 60 pages, depending on the designer's settings. A designer might choose fewer pages with smaller symbols, while another might spread the same chart across many pages so that the symbols are larger and easier to read. In other words, the number of pages doesn't necessarily tell us very much about the actual size of the project. But if someone tells me that they have completed 25% of a project, I immediately have a fairly good idea of where they are in the stitching journey. If they tell me they've finished 10 pages, I know nothing really, because I don't really know how those pages were laid out in the first place. So when I'm stitching, I simply continue following the pattern wherever it takes me, and I don't pay much attention to page boundaries. Next question. Where can I buy DMC threads, and is it cheaper to buy in bulk? Questions about where I buy my supplies are always a little difficult for me to answer because I live in Poland and most of my purchases come from embroidery shops here online. So unfortunately, the specific stores I use probably won't be very helpful for many of you who live in other countries. However, I know that people often ask about the tools and supplies I use, so I've put together a collection of products that I was able to find on Amazon and added them to my Amazon storefront. I will leave a link in the video description in case that's helpful. As for DMC threads, pricing seems to vary quite a lot depending on where you live and where you shop. One thing I've noticed is that individual skeins on Amazon can sometimes be surprisingly expensive. I've seen prices around $4 per one skein, which feels really high to me. Here in Poland, I usually pay the equivalent of around 87 cents per skein, so the difference can be substantial. Of course, prices vary from country to country, so your local experience may be completely different. One online shop that I hear mentioned very frequently by stitchers is 123stitch. Whenever people discuss affordable DMC floss, that name tends to come up quite often. I had a quick look recently, and at the time I checked, a skein was around 76 cents, which seems like a very reasonable price. So if you're building a large collection of colors, it may be worth comparing prices between specialty needlework shops and larger marketplaces before placing an order. Another question. Does row by row method work well for confetti heavy patterns? I would actually say that the row by row method works exceptionally well for confetti heavy patterns. There are two main reasons for that. The first reason is stitch quality. When working row by row, you are almost always starting a stitch in an empty hole. Because the hole is open and unobstructed, the thread passes through more easily and the stitches tend to look a little neater and more consistent. The only stitch that is slightly different is the final stitch on the left side of each row because there are already stitches surrounding it. However, those neighboring stitches have already been completed, there are no loose parked threads in the way, and the holes generally remain easy to access. The second reason is accuracy. Confetti heavy areas involve constant color changes, and whenever there are many color changes, there is a greater opportunity for mistakes. One of the things I like about the row by row method is that it naturally slows me down. Because I focus on one stitch at a time and follow the pattern very carefully, I find that mistakes happen much less frequently. And that actually brings me to something I would like to say to those of you who are trying the parking method for the first time. I know there are quite a few of you. My advice is very simple. Don't panic. Just trust the process. At some point, you will reach an area where it feels as though every stitch is a different color. You will have threads hanging down everywhere. You'll look at the fabric and wonder whether you've accidentally created some sort of stitching disaster. You haven't. That's perfectly normal. In those moments, the most important thing you can do is slow down. Avoid the temptation to stitch ahead into the next row just because a color happens to be nearby. Don't take shortcuts. Don't try to outsmart the process. Simply focus on the row you're working on right now. One stitch, then the next stitch, then the next one. Slowly and carefully work your way across the row. There may be several rows that look equally chaotic. That's okay. Keep following the pattern. Keep parking your threads. Keep moving forward one stitch at a time. Don't rush. What you'll eventually notice is that some threads will naturally come to an end, other threads will move into different diagonals. Gradually the number of active threads will begin to decrease. And at some point you will look down and realize that you've successfully worked your way through an area that once seemed impossible. That moment feels incredibly satisfying, not only because you've completed a difficult section, but because you've proven to yourself that you can do it. That's just how the parking method works. At first it can look complicated, messy, and overwhelming, but once you break it down into individual stitches, it becomes surprisingly simple. Everything makes sense, everything is manageable, and all you really have to do is keep taking it one stitch at a time. Okay, so now I've reached the end of the second diagonal. As you probably noticed, the first diagonal is always a small triangle, while the second diagonal spans across two 10 by 10 blocks. Let me zoom out for a moment so that you can see how everything looks at this stage. You may also notice that when I park threads into the next diagonal, I place them behind a needle minder. These are all the threads that I'll be using later when I start working on the next diagonal, and keeping them grouped together like this helps me stay organized. For those of you who are curious, this is also what the back of the project looks like at the moment. Some of the longer carried threads will eventually be partially stitched over, so I'm not concerned about them. Everything is behaving exactly as I would expect at this stage of the project. You may also notice that I'm not using traditional side tensioners. Instead, I'm using a simple white thread attached between the fabric and the sidebars of the scroll frame. The cords on my regular side tensioners are actually a little too long for the setup, and I found them slightly annoying to work with. This simple thread solution gives me excellent tension, and I quite like the more organic and lightweight feel of it. So that's the method I've been using recently. I also stitched 2 additional diagonals off camera so that we can move a little further ahead. We're now ready to work on the first full diagonal that spans across 3 10 by 10 blocks. I decided to record this particular section because the color changes become much more interesting here. We'll be moving from yellows into soft violet tones. then through some cream shades, and finally into warmer copper colors. So this should be a fun section to stitch and a good example of how the parking method handles frequent color changes. Here you can see how I start my threads. This is the method I currently use for both 1 strand and 2 strands on 16 count and 20 count Aida. First I go down through the fabric a few stitches away from where I want to begin. Then I come back up through the center of the stitch I'm about to make and go down through the top right corner, through the top right hole. At that point, I gently pull the thread so that the tail disappears under the fabric. Then I simply complete the stitch as usual. It's very similar to a half pin stitch start, except that I don't leave the tail on top of the fabric and trim it later. Instead, I hide the tail underneath the fabric from the beginning, and it will eventually be stitched over and secured. I found that this method works well on 16 count Aida and on 20 count Aida. And also, it works well with both 1 strand and 2 strands. With 2 strands, if I have a loop available, I will still use a loop start because it's quick and secure and easy, but when a loop start isn't possible, this is actually the method I use. For 1 strand stitching, this is definitely my favorite way to start a thread. Now we have our first little situation that I would like to comment on. So I made the first stitch here and then parked the thread. The next stitch of the same color happens to be in the same row. Technically, I didn't have to park the thread here. At this point, I'm following the process very strictly because I don't want to confuse anyone who is learning the method for the first time. However, this is one of those situations where I would normally make the second stitch immediately. Why? Because there is no parked thread occupying the hole on the right side. When I make the second leg of the stitch, I would still be coming up through an empty hole. Nothing is blocking the path of the thread. So there is no disadvantage to stitching it right away. Situations like this are one of the small ways I speed up the process. And here we have another example. The next color also has 2 stitches in the same row. Again, I could make both stitches immediately for exactly the same reason. There is no parked thread in the bottom right hole of the second stitch, so nothing would interfere with the stitch formation. Once you become familiar with the method, you will naturally start recognizing these little opportunities. You still follow the overall parking structure, but you don't necessarily have to park after every single stitch if there is a perfectly safe opportunity to continue. These yellow shades are actually very close to one another in color. When we are zoomed in like this, the differences can seem almost insignificant, but those subtle variations are incredibly important because they help create separation between the individual sunflower petals. That's one of the fascinating things about color. Sometimes a tiny shift in value or temperature can make a surprisingly big difference in the final image. Right now it may look like a collection of random stitches, but once we zoom out later, those subtle color changes will come together and the shapes will become much easier to see. You may also notice that I can't really see my grid lines anymore. To make counting easier, I occasionally redraw them using a water-soluble marker. I mainly use the grid as a guide for parking threads and for keeping track of the 10 by 10 blocks, so refreshing those lines from time to time helps me avoid counting mistakes. Here I move into the next row and make the first 3 stitches right away. You may also notice that I've been experimenting with a slightly different stitching motion. I'm not actually sure whether this technique has a specific name. If it does, please let me know in the comments because I would be curious to learn. The idea is that after I go down through the fabric, I don't immediately pull the thread all the way through. Instead, I come back up for the second leg of the stitch and only then pull the thread tight. I hope you can see what I'm doing on the screen. So rather than pulling the thread underneath the fabric after every movement, I mostly pull it from the front. I remember hearing someone say that this can make stitches slightly less neat, but honestly I haven't noticed a significant difference myself. What I have noticed is that it feels a little faster. The only thing I am still unsure about is whether it's harder on the thread in the long run. It's definitely a bit more friction between the thread and the fabric, but I honestly don't know whether that has any meaningful impact. If any of you have experience with this method, I would be interested to hear your thoughts. For now, I find myself using it quite often, especially when stitching with a single strand and particularly in larger areas of the same color. Here you can see me starting another thread. As before, I go down a few stitches away, come up through the center of the stitch I'm about to make, and then go down through the top right hole. At that point, I gently pull the thread until the tail disappears underneath the fabric, and then I continue stitching normally. This is actually my first project using a single strand throughout, and I have to admit that it took a little while to get used to it. At first, everything felt very small on 20 count fabric. More than that, the single strand itself felt incredibly delicate and fragile. But after the first few rows, I stopped thinking about it and everything began to feel much more natural. One thing I really enjoy is how easy it is to thread the needle with a single strand. It takes only a moment, and I was also surprised by how many stitches I can get from a single length of thread. So far, I am really enjoying the experience. I still want to try 25 count because I'd like to compare the two properly. I know 25 count is very popular among full coverage stitchers, but I'm not sure whether it might be a little too small for me. We'll see. The only way to know for certain is to try it. Here we have another example of one of the exceptions I mentioned earlier. I make these stitches and then continue into the next row. In this particular situation, I could actually stitch the next group from left to right instead of right to left. Why? Because these are the first 5 stitches in the row, they sit directly beside one another, and there are no additional stitches of the color further to the left. That means I can work through them without encountering any parked threads. And that's really the key point. The whole reason I normally work from right to left is because of the parked threads. If I worked from left to right all the time, I would constantly run into parked threads when making the second leg of the stitch. In this case, there are no parked threads in the way, so I have the freedom to choose whichever direction is most convenient. As you become more familiar with the method, you'll start noticing these little opportunities naturally. The parking method may look very rigid from the outside, but in practice, there is quite a bit of flexibility once you understand the reasoning behind it. After making those 5 stitches in the next row, I return to the second row to finish it. As you've probably noticed by now, I generally prefer to work step by step and stitch by stitch. Following the pattern in a very systematic way helps me stay organized and reduces the chance of mistake. Now we have another example of one of those little exceptions I mentioned earlier. Notice this half circle symbol. After making these 2 stitches, I could immediately continue with the next 2 stitches of the same color in the row below. Why would that be possible? Well, those 2 stitches are located on the left side of the row, there are already stitches above them, and most importantly, there is no parked thread on the right side that would interfere with the second leg of the stitch. So technically, I could continue stitching those 2 stitches straight away. However, I always have a choice. I can either take advantage of the opportunity and stitch ahead, or I can simply park the thread and continue following the strict row by row approach. In this case, I chose to park. I often try to avoid stitching too far ahead because once I start jumping between rows too frequently, the structure becomes less obvious to me and things can start to feel a little more chaotic, and also the mistakes can happen. That said, when I want to speed up the process, I will absolutely take advantage of these opportunities. And here we have another interesting example. Notice that this symbol appears again in the next row. There are 2 stitches of this color sitting side by side. This time they are not at the beginning of the row and they are not at the end of the row. They are actually located in the middle. At first glance it might seem that I would have to park the thread. But if we look more closely, we can see that there is still no parked thread on the right side that would interfere with the stitch, and there are already completed stitches above. Because of that, I could safely make both stitches immediately. Again, I choose not to. Instead, I parked the thread and continued with the row by row, stitch by stitch approach. One thing I want to emphasize is that these exceptions are optional. You don't need to use them. If you're learning the parking method, I would actually recommend following the process very strictly at first. Once the method becomes your second nature, you'll start recognizing these opportunities automatically and can decide for yourself whether taking them makes sense. The important thing is understanding why they work. In most cases, if there is no parked thread on the right side to interfere with your stitch and the surrounding stitches already support the hole, then stitching ahead is often perfectly safe. Whether you take advantage of that opportunity is entirely up to you. I continue working methodically through each row from right to left, 1 stitch at a time. For me, this approach provides the highest level of control. It's calm, it's organized, and because I'm only focusing on 1 stitch at a time, mistakes happen much less frequently. Is it the fastest way to stitch? Of course not, but speed has never been my goal. I enjoy slow methodical stitching. I enjoy the process just as much as the finished result. One of the things I particularly like about this method is that I rarely have to make decisions while stitching. I don't have to wonder which color I should pick up next. I don't have to decide where to travel. I don't have to think about where to park a thread. The system makes those decisions for me. And because of that, stitching becomes very relaxing. Quite often, I'll be watching YouTube, listening to a podcast, or simply thinking about something completely unrelated while stitching. The process becomes almost automatic. Sometimes I will look up after an hour and realize that I've stitched 100 stitches without really noticing the time passing. And honestly, I think that this is one of the reasons why I enjoy this method so much. Now we have another example of one of those optional exceptions. This time we're looking at the half circle symbol. There are 3 stitches of this color in the row. 2 are next to each other, followed by the moon symbols, and then there is a third half circle stitch. In this situation, I can actually make all 3 half circle stitches immediately. The reason is that the parked thread of the first moon symbol won't interfere with the second leg of the third half circle stitch. In other words, even though there are other stitches between them, there is still a clear path for the thread. So after making the first 2 stitches, I can safely jump to the third one without creating any problems. And notice that doing so doesn't affect the moon symbol stitches at all. This is another example of how the parking method can be more flexible than it first appears. The next symbol continues into the row below. Because the first 2 stitches in that row are immediately available, I can stitch them straight away and then park the thread in the third row. Again, this isn't something that you have to do. It's simply an option. Most of these little shortcuts are opportunities rather than rules. The row by row method works perfectly well without them, but once you become comfortable with the process, they can help you move through the pattern a little more effectively while still maintaining the same organized structure. Here we have a situation that looks very similar to the previous example. We have 2 stitches of the same symbol, then a gap, and then a 3rd stitch of that symbol. At first glance, it might seem that I could stitch all 3 immediately, just like I did before. But in this case, I can't. I can safely make the first 2 stitches on the right, but I will not make the 3rd stitch. Why? Because if I tried to stitch that 3rd one, I would run into a loose parked thread while making the 2nd leg of that stitch. And that's exactly what I'm trying to avoid. The reason I work from right to left is to keep the holes clear when I come up for the 2nd leg of the stitch. If a parked thread is already occupying that area, the hole becomes more crowded, I have to deal with a loose parked thread, and the stitch may not form as neatly. So even though this situation looks very similar to the previous example, the presence of the parked thread changes everything. So I ask myself one question: will a parked thread interfere with the stitch? If the answer is no, I can often stitch ahead. If the answer is yes, I stop, park the thread, and continue following the row by row process. Here we have another similar situation. This time there is 1 stitch, then a gap, and then 2 more stitches of the same color. Can I make all 3 stitches immediately? No. In this case I can make the first stitch, but after that I will park the thread. The reason is the same as before. If I try to continue and make the 2nd stitch, I would encounter a loose parked thread from a different color while working the 2nd leg of the stitch. That's something I prefer to avoid whenever possible. So rather than forcing it, I simply park the thread and continue following the method. However, because I know I will be returning to the same color very shortly, I don't bother unthreading the needle. I simply put the needle on hold for a moment by parking it in the fabric off to the side. That way it's ready and waiting for me when I need it again. Now we have another small opportunity where I could choose to stitch ahead. Notice this single stitch in the next row, directly below the stitch I just completed. I could make that stitch immediately. There is no parked thread on the right side that would interfere with the 2nd leg, and there are no additional stitches of that color in that row. So from a technical point of view, there would be no problem at all. But I don't have to take every shortcut that presents itself. I can also choose to park the thread and continue following the pattern 1 row at a time. And in this case, that's exactly what I decided to do. As I've mentioned before, these little exceptions are optional. The row by row approach works perfectly well without them. Sometimes I take advantage of them and sometimes I don't. Most of the time I simply choose whichever option feels the most organized and comfortable in the moment. Here once again you can see the thread start method I've been using recently whenever a loop start isn't possible. I go down through the fabric a few stitches away from where I want to begin, usually around 3 to 5 stitches away, then come up through the center of the stitch I'm about to make and complete a half pin stitch start. After that I gently pull the thread until the tail disappears underneath the fabric, and then I continue stitching normally. The idea is that the tail will eventually be secured by the stitches on the back of the fabric, while the half pin stitch provides a little extra security right from the beginning. I've also noticed something interesting when it comes to piercing the fabric through the middle of the stitch. Sometimes when I'm struggling to get the needle through, the solution is actually to use less force rather than more. It sounds a little counterintuitive, but I've found that when I push more gently, the needle often finds the way through the fabric much more easily. If I push too hard, I sometimes end up fighting the fabric instead of working with it. So occasionally slowing down and using a lighter touch can actually make stitching easier. Another thing worth considering is using a thimble or thimble pads, especially if you're stitching with smaller needles such as size 28. Those needles are really thin, and I've definitely learned that the hard way. When I first started using them, I occasionally pushed a little too enthusiastically and managed to puncture my finger more than once. So if you find yourself putting a lot of pressure on the needle, some form of finger protection might be worth trying. Your fingers will probably appreciate it. Here we have a situation where there is a block of the same color and each row is shifted one stitch to the right compared to the row above it. This allows us to stitch all of these symbols, and we can also use the snake method. Because there are no loose spark threads that could interfere with the second leg of the stitch, I can safely move back and forth through this section. I stitch one row from right to left and then the next row from left to right, gradually working my way through the block. Situations like this are always satisfying because they allow us to move through a larger area quite efficiently while still following the same general principles. So I stitched all of these symbols and then checked where the next stitch of that color appeared. It turned out that the next stitch was in the following diagonal and was quite far away, so I decided to end the thread here. Here I would also like to say a few words to those of you who have only recently started using the perking method and may be feeling a little overwhelmed by all these threads. As you can see, in this row I have different colors coming out of almost every hole. There are additional perked threads below, more colors waiting, and overall it can look quite chaotic. If you are new to perking, this is usually the moment when you start wondering whether you've made a terrible mistake and whether you will ever be able to untangle this colorful mess. Let me reassure you, this is completely normal. Every full coverage pattern contains section where almost every stitch is a different color. In those areas you will naturally accumulate a larger number of perked threads. And then just a little further along, you may encounter a large area of the same color where very little seems to be happening. That's simply the nature of full coverage stitching. The important thing is not to look at all the threads at once. Don't think about the entire diagonal. Don't think about the entire page. Don't think about the entire project. Just think about the next stitch. And then the next one. And then the next one after that. If you follow the process and continue working methodically stitch by stitch, you'll notice something interesting. Within a few minutes, the situation begins to improve by itself. Some threads will need to be parked further away, some colors will come to an end, some colors will disappear from the fabric, and suddenly the crowd starts getting smaller. So if you're looking at a confetti heavy section and feeling overwhelmed, don't panic. It's all part of the process. In fact, this is exactly where the row by row method shines. First, it allows you to work slowly and systematically through every stitch without feeling lost. You always know where you are, you always know what comes next, and if you need to stop for a break, you can come back later and immediately continue where you left off. Second, it's particularly effective in confetti heavy areas because every stitch is made in exactly the same way. You don't need a different strategy for difficult sections. You simply keep following the same process. One stitch, then the next one, then the next one. That's all. Trust the process and slow down. Remember that you are not in a race. Nobody is chasing you. Nobody is judging how quickly you finish your project. Cross stitch is supposed to be enjoyable, so take your time. Personally, I actually enjoy those confetti heavy areas. I know that might sound strange, but I find them much more interesting than stitching large blocks of a single color. Not only do the frequent color changes keep me engaged, but they also introduce more variety into the stitching process. You're changing threads, rethreading needles, introducing new colors, and constantly watching the image develop. From a practical point of view, I sometimes think it's even better for my body. When I'm stitching a huge block of one color, the movements become very repetitive, and I can feel that in my back and shoulders after a while. Confetti areas force me to move a little more, change position more often, and vary my movements. When I encounter larger blocks of the same color, like this copper section here, I often use the stitching method that I mentioned earlier. Instead of pulling the thread all the way through underneath the fabric after each movement, I go down with the needle and immediately come back up through the next hole before pulling the thread tight. I find that this makes the stitching process a little faster. I've experimented with this method while stitching with 2 strands, but I have to say that it seems to work particularly well here on 20 count Aida with a single strand. And generally speaking, I have to admit that I'm really enjoying stitching on 20 count Aida. When I originally recorded this video, I had only completed this diagonal. Now while editing the video, I've already stitched 2 additional diagonals, which has given me a bit more time to evaluate how I feel about it, and so far my impression is very positive. The holes are still large enough to see comfortably, but because I'm only using a single strand, they don't become overcrowded. That makes stitching surprisingly comfortable. I've also noticed that cross-country stitching feels easier than it does on 16 count Aida with 2 strands. Even when I need to place a single stitch surrounded by other stitches, there is usually still enough room in the hole to work comfortably. So at the moment I'm quite happy with this setup. That said, I'm still curious about 25 count Lugana. I already have some Lugana fabric, but I recently ordered another piece that comes with a pre-printed grid. I think it's called Easy Grid. I know it will probably take a little time to get used to it because the grid lines run through the middle of the stitches rather than along the holes. But if so many other stitchers can adapt to it, I'm sure I can as well. The only problem is deciding what project to start next, but I think it will be the Forest Friends. Towards the end of this diagonal, I also did a little cross-country stitching because I was determined to finish this section while the camera was still recording. Unfortunately, I noticed that the battery indicator had started flashing, which is never a particularly reassuring sign. At that point, it felt like a race between me and the battery. Fortunately, I managed to finish this diagonal before the camera gave up. And here is the finished section. So far, I'm very happy with how it's coming together. I don't really like seeing the marker lines, especially under those lighter colors, but I know that's simply part of the process. Once the piece is finished and washed, those lines will disappear. I also think that the fabric may shrink a little bit, allowing the stitches to settle a little closer together, which should make the coverage look even nicer. And for those of you who always ask to see the back, here it is. I also took a photograph after completing 2 additional diagonals, so you can see how it looks at a slightly later stage. As for whether the back is neat or messy, I honestly couldn't tell you, mostly because I don't spend much time thinking about it. It is what it is. I'm not entering any competitions, and my goal is to enjoy the stitching process and create a piece that I'm happy with. Everything else is secondary. And with that, I think it's time to finish this video. Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed spending some stitching time together, and I hope that some of the things I shared were helpful. I hope to see you again in the next video. Happy stitching! Bye!